You are not about to learn how to focus better. You are about to replace the operating system that determines how you work, think, and produce. Most people believe focus is something you must force. That belief is why they feel scattered, inconsistent, and exhausted. They try harder inside a broken model and mistake effort for progress. This audiobook exists to correct that error at the root. Hyperfocus is not willpower. It is not motivation. It is not discipline. It is the natural consequence of a system that is aligned with objective reality. When perception is accurate, decisions become obvious. When decisions are obvious, action stops requiring effort. When action stops requiring effort, output multiplies. This audiobook shows you how to engineer that alignment. By the time you finish listening and practicing what is taught here, you will not be chasing focus anymore. Focus will become your default state. Distraction will stop feeling like a temptation and start feeling like friction you no longer tolerate. Work that once felt heavy will feel neutral. Progress will feel inevitable. The transformation you will experience is structural, not emotional. You will stop relying on motivation because you will understand why motivation was never reliable. You will stop negotiating with your attention because the system will already be decided in advance. Instead of fighting your own mind, you will reposition it. This book is not a collection of hacks or techniques. It is a causal sequence. Each chapter removes a specific distortion that currently leaks your attention and drains your output. As those distortions disappear, focus emerges automatically. If you listen casually, this audiobook will be interesting. If you apply it, it will change how you execute, and if you practice the protocols consistently, the results will not feel dramatic at first. They will feel obvious. That is the promise. You are not here to feel motivated. You are here to become precise. And precision is what turns effort into inevitability. Chapter 1. The Illusion of a Focus Deficit. Most people believe they have a focus problem. They assume their attention is weak, unreliable, or damaged. This belief becomes the first and most dangerous distortion because it directs effort toward the wrong target. When you believe the problem is internal failure, you attempt to fix yourself. When the problem is structural, that effort is wasted. What most people call lack of focus is not an absence of attention. It is attention being pulled in too many directions at once. Attention does not disappear, it fragments, and fragmented attention cannot lock onto anything long enough to produce depth, momentum, or satisfaction. The modern environment is engineered to fragment perception. Multiple objectives compete for relevance. Information arrives faster than it can be processed. Tasks are initiated without clear endpoints. Each of these conditions forces the brain into continuous reorientation. Reorientation is costly. It consumes cognitive energy before meaningful work even begins. This is why you can feel exhausted without having produced anything measurable. Energy is being spent deciding what matters, not executing what matters. When you sit down to work and feel restless, resistant, or mentally foggy, that sensation is commonly interpreted as laziness or lack of discipline. In reality, it is the signal of unresolved priority conflict. Your brain cannot commit because nothing has been made dominant. It is waiting for clarity, not motivation. Most productivity advice attempts to override this state through effort. Work harder, push through, eliminate distractions by force. These approaches fail because they treat a structural problem as a character flaw. Willpower can temporarily suppress confusion, but it cannot resolve it. When willpower collapses, the system reverts to fragmentation. This repeated failure trains a dangerous conclusion that you are inconsistent, unfocused, or incapable of sustained effort. Over time, this belief hardens into identity. You stop trusting yourself to follow through. You lower expectations. You accept shallow output as normal. The truth is less dramatic and more useful. Your brain is functioning exactly as designed. It evolved to detect novelty, scan for threats, and respond to change. In unstable environments, sustained focus was a liability. Vigilance kept you alive. The modern world rewards the opposite behavior, but the underlying machinery has not changed. The error is not in the brain. The error is in the environment and the model used to operate within it. When you attempt to suppress distraction without understanding its cause, you create internal resistance. The mind fights back. Focus feels painful. Work feels heavy. You interpret this resistance as a signal that something is wrong, when it is actually evidence that the system is misaligned. The promise at this stage is not increased productivity, it is relief. Once you understand that focus failure is mechanical, not personal, self-blame dissolves. When self-blame dissolves, mental energy returns. When mental energy returns, clarity becomes possible. As you begin applying the principles in this book, you will notice a specific improvement. The initial friction at the start of work will decrease. The urge to escape will weaken. The need to constantly check something else will fade. Not because you force discipline, but because the system no longer demands constant choice. This is the first measurable gain: reduced cognitive friction. Focus begins to emerge not when you try harder, but when fewer things compete for relevance. When perception stabilizes, attention follows naturally. You do not have to hold it, it locks in on its own. This chapter removes the false diagnosis. Without removing it, every technique that follows would fail. With it removed, you are no longer fighting yourself. You are preparing to redesign the system that governs your attention. In the next chapter, we will map that system explicitly. You will see the causal chain that creates hyperfocus and the exact points where it breaks down. Once the structure is visible, control becomes inevitable. Chapter 2. The causal system behind hyperfocus. Hyperfocus does not appear randomly. It is not a mood. It is not inspiration. It is not something you fall into by luck. Hyperfocus is the predictable outcome of a system operating without distortion. To understand how focus actually works, you must stop thinking in terms of effort and start thinking in terms of causality. Every result you experience is produced by a sequence. When the sequence is intact, the result is inevitable. When the sequence is broken, no amount of force can compensate. Focus follows a simple chain. Perception shapes decisions. Decisions shape actions. Actions produce results, and results reinforce identity. When any link in this chain is inaccurate, attention collapses. Most people try to intervene at the wrong point. They attempt to control action directly. They try to sit down and focus while ignoring the fact that perception upstream is chaotic. This is equivalent to demanding precision from a machine with misaligned inputs. The failure is guaranteed. Perception is the gatekeeper. Before you take a single action, your brain is already evaluating relevance, risk, reward, and cost. If these variables are unclear, contradictory, or overloaded, decision-making slows. When decisions slow, action feels heavy. When action feels heavy, avoidance emerges. This is not weakness, it is efficiency. The brain is conserving energy in the presence of uncertainty. This is why clarity feels energizing. It removes the need to calculate. When perception is accurate, decisions become obvious. Obvious decisions do not require motivation. They execute themselves. This is the first promise of understanding the system. You will stop needing to convince yourself to work. Hyperfocus occurs when perception collapses, complexity into a single dominant vector. One objective matters more than all others. All competing inputs are either removed or deprioritized. The brain no longer scans, it commits. This commitment is not emotional. It is mechanical. Contrast this with how most people operate. They open a task while carrying multiple unresolved intentions. They want progress, validation, speed, perfection, and relief simultaneously. Each intention pulls attention in a different direction. The brain attempts to satisfy all of them and satisfies none. The result is shallow work, frequent switching, and the sensation of constant effort with little output. When you understand the system, a powerful shift occurs. You stop asking, "How do I focus longer?" and start asking, "What is fragmenting perception right now?" This question has answers, and answers can be acted upon. As you apply this model, you will notice a second measurable improvement. Decision latency decreases. You spend less time hesitating, reevaluating, or second-guessing. The space between intention and action shrinks. Work starts faster. This is not because you became more confident. It is because the system no longer requires negotiation. Identity plays a critical role here. Every result feeds back into how you see yourself. When your actions produce consistent output, your identity shifts toward reliability. When identity shifts, behavior stabilizes. Focus becomes easier not because conditions are perfect, but because the system is now self-reinforcing. Most people never reach this stage because they attempt to change identity directly. They tell themselves they are focused, disciplined, or productive. But identity does not respond to language. It responds to evidence. This book is designed to generate that evidence deliberately, through structure. The promise at this stage is momentum. When the causal chain is repaired, small actions produce disproportionate results. You begin to trust yourself again. That trust reduces internal friction even further. Focus deepens not through effort, but through alignment. Hyperfocus is not sustained by intensity. It is sustained by the absence of contradiction. When nothing inside you argues against the task, attention has nowhere else to go. In the next chapter, we will dismantle the most common distortion that breaks this chain, the belief that effort creates results. You will see why effort is usually a signal of inefficiency, and how removing friction multiplies output faster than working harder ever could. Chapter 3. Why Effort Never Created Hyperfocus. Effort is the most misunderstood variable in human performance. It is praised, celebrated, and moralized. Yet it consistently fails to produce the outcomes people expect from it. Nowhere is this more visible than in focus and productivity. Most people assume that if they are not producing, the solution is to try harder, increase intensity, push through resistance, apply pressure. This assumption feels logical, but it is mechanically wrong. Effort is not a primary driver of output. It is a compensatory signal. Effort appears when the system is misaligned. When perception is unclear, decisions become costly. When decisions are costly, action feels heavy. Effort is the subjective sensation of dragging action through uncertainty. It is not a virtue. It is friction made conscious. This is why sustained effort is exhausting. You are not tired because the work is hard. You are tired because the system is inefficient. Consider how hyperfocus actually feels when it occurs naturally. There is intensity, but there is very little strain. Time compresses. Action flows. You are not forcing attention to stay. It stays because there is nowhere else it needs to go. This state is not created by effort. It is created by alignment. The mistake most people make is trying to recreate this state by adding pressure. They increase stakes, deadlines, self-criticism, or fear. These tools can create short bursts of action, but they are unstable. They consume psychological energy faster than they produce results. Over time, this trains an unhealthy loop. Work becomes associated with tension. Focus becomes associated with pain. Avoidance becomes a form of self-regulation. The brain learns that effort equals threat, and it resists accordingly. This is why motivation feels unreliable. Motivation is an emotional response to anticipated reward minus anticipated cost. When cost is inflated by friction, motivation collapses. No amount of inspirational language can override this calculation for long. The promise of this chapter is not that you will stop working hard. It is that you will stop needing to. When friction is removed, effort drops automatically. Output does not decrease, it increases. This feels counterintuitive only because most people have never experienced a well-designed system. Effort is not what creates progress. Precision does. Precision means knowing exactly what matters, what does not, and what happens next. It means decisions are made once, upstream instead of repeatedly, downstream. It means ambiguity is eliminated before action begins, not confronted during execution. When precision is high, effort becomes optional. You can still apply it, but it is no longer required to maintain momentum. Work feels lighter, not because it is easier, but because resistance has been removed from the path. As you begin applying this principle, you will notice a clear improvement. The internal dialogue that precedes work will quiet. You will spend less time psyching yourself up and more time simply starting. The transition into work will shorten. The recovery from interruption will accelerate. This is a measurable gain, faster entry into execution. Another illusion this chapter dismantles is the belief that exhaustion is proof of productivity. Many people end the day tired but unsatisfied. They confuse energy expenditure with value creation. In reality, exhaustion often signals excessive decision-making, constant context switching, and unresolved priorities. Hyperfocus produces a different kind of fatigue. It is localized, not global. You may feel mentally full but not scattered, tired but not drained. This distinction matters. It tells you whether the system is working. Effort-driven work depletes identity. Alignment-driven work reinforces it. When you consistently rely on effort, you teach yourself that progress requires suffering. This makes consistency fragile. When you rely on alignment, you teach yourself that progress is the natural result of clarity. This makes consistency stable. The long-term promise here is sustainability. You are not designed to operate at maximum strain indefinitely. No one is. Systems that depend on effort always break. Systems that depend on design persist. By removing effort as the primary lever, you gain access to a more powerful one. Inevitability. When the correct action is the easiest action, behavior no longer needs to be managed. It executes itself. This is the shift that separates high performers from everyone else. Not superior willpower, but superior system design. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into this design by addressing identity. You will see why focus cannot be sustained if it conflicts with how you see yourself, and how to rebuild an operational identity that makes hyperfocus the default rather than the exception. Chapter 4. The Identity of the Focused Operator. Hyperfocus cannot be sustained if it contradicts identity. This is the constraint most people never see, and because they do not see it, they fight themselves indefinitely. They attempt to install new behaviors on top of an old self-concept, and are surprised when the system rejects the update. Behavior does not originate from intention. It originates from identity. What you do consistently is not what you want. It is what you believe yourself to be. If you identify as someone who struggles to focus, every attempt at deep work will feel like an exception. Exceptions require energy. They feel unnatural. They break under pressure. If you identify as someone who is trying to be disciplined, discipline will always feel fragile, temporary, and effortful. Hyperfocus becomes stable only when it is congruent with how you see yourself. Most people attempt to change identity through language. They repeat affirmations. They adopt labels. They tell themselves new stories. This fails because identity does not respond to narrative. It responds to evidence. The brain updates its self-model only after repeated, observable proof. This is why reading about focus does not create focus. Understanding does not override identity. Action does. The operator identity introduced in this book is not aspirational. It is operational. It is defined by behavior, not belief. An operator does not wait for internal alignment. An operator acts based on external criteria. Emotion is irrelevant. Mood is irrelevant. The only question is whether the system is ready. This shift alone removes enormous friction. When you stop asking how you feel and start asking whether the inputs are correct, work becomes mechanical. Mechanical work is repeatable. Repeatable work produces evidence. Evidence updates identity. This is the loop you are building. As you begin applying this identity model, you will notice a change in self-talk. The internal debate before starting will shorten. The question will no longer be, do I feel like doing this, but is this the next correct action? This is not semantic, it is structural. The operator identity also changes how resistance is interpreted. Resistance is no longer a stop signal. It is information. It indicates that the current action conflicts with an old identity that is being phased out. When you understand this, resistance loses its authority. Most people retreat at the first sign of discomfort because they interpret it as danger. The operator interprets discomfort as boundary detection. It shows where identity ends and growth begins. This creates a second promise: consistency. When behavior is no longer negotiated internally, consistency stabilizes. You stop oscillating between intensity and avoidance. Output becomes predictable. Predictability compounds. Another critical aspect of identity is standards. The operator does not measure effort. The operator measures precision and completion. Partial work is not progress. Busy work is not productivity. Clear outputs define success. As standards shift, attention follows. The mind aligns with what is measured. When completion matters more than appearance, focus deepens. When clarity matters more than speed, errors decrease. These are not motivational outcomes, they are systemic ones. Over time, the identity shift becomes self-reinforcing. You begin to see yourself as someone who finishes, someone who executes, someone who locks in when required. This perception changes how you approach tasks before you even start them. Focus initiates faster because the system expects completion. This expectation reduces friction even further. The long-term promise of adopting the operator identity is stability. You are no longer dependent on optimal conditions. You do not need silence, perfect timing, or emotional readiness. You need alignment. Alignment can be engineered. As identity stabilizes, hyperfocus stops feeling like a special state. It becomes the absence of interference. Work happens because nothing inside you argues against it. This chapter establishes the internal foundation. Without it, every external optimization will eventually fail. With it, the system can support sustained depth. In the next chapter, we move outward. You will learn how to engineer your environment so that it reinforces this identity automatically. When the environment agrees with the operator, focus becomes the path of least resistance. Chapter 5. Engineering the cognitive environment. Your environment is already controlling your focus. The only question is whether it is doing so accidentally or deliberately. Most people treat environment as background, something neutral, something external. This is another perceptual error. Environment is not passive. It is an active decision-making engine that operates before conscious thought appears. By the time you decide to focus, the environment has already voted, and it usually votes against you. This is why focus feels fragile. You are attempting to override a system that has already been optimized for distraction. Every object in your environment carries an instruction. Screens invite consumption. Notifications invite reaction. Open tabs invite context switching. Unfinished tasks invite mental leakage. None of this is random. Each element competes for cognitive priority, and the brain responds automatically. You do not choose what captures your attention. Your nervous system does. When the environment is dense with stimuli, perception fragments before work even begins. This forces the brain into scanning mode. Scanning mode is incompatible with hyperfocus. It keeps attention shallow, mobile, and defensive. You feel busy, alert, and tired, but never locked in. Most people respond to this by adding rules. Don't check the phone, ignore distractions, resist temptation. These strategies fail because they rely on continuous self-control. Self-control is expensive. It depletes. When it fails, people blame themselves instead of the system. The promise of environmental engineering is simple and powerful. When the environment is correct, focus requires no resistance. Instead of asking yourself to be stronger, you redesign conditions so that distraction is inconvenient and depth is obvious. This is not about aesthetics. It is about behavioral economics applied to attention. The brain always chooses the lowest cost option available. If distraction is cheap and work is expensive, distraction wins. If work is cheap and distraction is costly, focus wins. This happens automatically without motivation. Environmental design is how you shift that cost structure. As you begin applying this principle, the first improvement you will notice is reduced internal negotiation. You will stop talking yourself into work. You will stop making micro decisions about where to look, what to click, what to do next. Those decisions will have been made in advance by design. This alone frees enormous cognitive bandwidth. Another critical function of environment is identity reinforcement. Your surroundings constantly signal who you are and how you are supposed to behave. A cluttered environment signals unfinished thinking. A reactive environment signals urgency. A chaotic environment signals lack of control. When you work inside these signals, your behavior conforms to them. The operator environment does the opposite. It communicates clarity, limitation, and direction. There is less available, not more. Fewer inputs, fewer options, fewer paths. This constraint is not restrictive. It is liberating. It collapses choice. When choice collapses, action accelerates. You will also notice that properly engineered environments reduce recovery time. Interruptions still happen, but re-entry becomes faster. Because context is stable, attention snaps back instead of drifting. This is a compounding advantage that most people never experience. Over days and weeks, this creates a profound shift. Focus stops feeling like something you enter and exit. It feels like the default. Distraction feels foreign. Noise feels loud. Shallow work feels inefficient. This is not willpower training. It is perceptual conditioning. Most importantly, environment allows you to act independently of emotion. When the system is set, you do not need to feel ready. You simply arrive and execute. The environment carries the intention for you. This creates reliability. Reliability produces evidence. Evidence reshapes identity. Identity stabilizes focus. This is the full loop beginning to close. The long-term promise of environmental engineering is not just better work sessions. It is reduced cognitive load across your entire day. You stop carrying work in your head. You stop reopening loops mentally. Your nervous system downshifts because fewer decisions are demanded of it. Calm is not created by rest. It is created by clarity. When environment and identity agree, hyperfocus is no longer something you try to access. It is the natural consequence of being in the correct place at the correct time with the correct constraints. In the next chapter, we will quantify this further by examining attention itself as an economic resource. You will learn how internal and external attention are spent, wasted, and conserved, and how controlling this economy multiplies output without increasing time or effort. Chapter 6: The Economy of Attention and Why Most People Are Always Broke. Attention is not infinite, it is not elastic. It does not expand because you want more output. Attention is a finite economic resource governed by cost, return, and leakage. Most people operate as if attention were free, and that assumption keeps them permanently bankrupt. Every moment of focus you experience is the result of a transaction. Attention is allocated where the perceived return is highest and the perceived cost is lowest. This calculation happens automatically, below conscious awareness. You do not decide where your attention goes. The system does. This is why distraction is not a moral failure. It is an economic outcome. When a notification pulls you away from work, it is not because you are weak. It is because the notification offered a cheaper reward than the task you were engaged in. Cheaper does not mean better. It means faster, clearer, and less ambiguous. The brain optimizes for immediate certainty, not long-term value. Most work tasks are abstract, delayed, and cognitively expensive. They require sustained commitment before payoff appears. Distractions, by contrast, offer instant feedback with minimal effort. The brain makes the obvious choice. The mistake most people make is trying to shame the brain out of this behavior. They attempt to override economics with morality. This never works. Systems do not respond to guilt. They respond to incentives. If you want hyperfocus, you must restructure the attention economy. Attention is spent in two places simultaneously, externally and internally. External attention is directed toward stimuli, tools, information, and tasks. Internal attention is consumed by self-talk, evaluation, doubt, and emotional regulation. Most people underestimate how much attention is being burned internally. When you question yourself while working, attention leaks. When you second-guess decisions, attention leaks. When you worry about whether you are doing the right thing, attention leaks. These leaks are invisible but devastating. They reduce the amount of attention available for execution. This is why even quiet environments fail to produce focus for many people. The noise is internal. Hyperfocus emerges when both external and internal attention costs are reduced simultaneously. This is a critical promise of this chapter. You will learn how to stop bleeding attention where you cannot see it. The first lever is cost. If a task feels expensive to engage with, attention will avoid it. Expense comes from ambiguity, not difficulty. When the brain does not know what success looks like, how long something will take, or what the next step is, it assigns a high cost to engagement. As cost rises, attention looks elsewhere. The second lever is reward clarity. The brain does not need large rewards. It needs predictable ones. Clear progress markers, visible movement, and defined endpoints dramatically increase. Perceived return. When return becomes obvious, attention commits. Most people try to motivate themselves with distant outcomes, long-term goals, future success, abstract meaning. These are too vague to compete in the moment. Hyperfocus is fueled by proximal certainty, not distant aspiration. As you apply this model, the first improvement you will notice is endurance. You will be able to stay with tasks longer without fatigue, not because you are tougher, but because attention is no longer being taxed unnecessarily. Less internal debate means more usable bandwidth. Another shift follows quickly. You will stop craving stimulation. When attention is fully occupied by a task with clear structure and visible progress, external noise loses appeal. Distraction becomes boring. This is one of the most reliable signals that the system is correcting. People often assume they are addicted to stimulation. In reality, they are starved for meaningful engagement. When engagement is restored, the craving disappears. The attention economy also explains why multitasking feels productive, but produces so little. Switching tasks creates the illusion of activity while destroying value. Every switch carries a transaction cost. Context must be unloaded and reloaded. This cost compounds rapidly. Hyperfocus eliminates this waste by collapsing attention into a single stream. One context, one objective, one direction. This is not restriction, it is efficiency. As the economy stabilizes, output begins to multiply without added time. You complete more not because you move faster, but because you stop paying unnecessary fees. No switching tax, no decision tax, no emotional tax. This creates a powerful secondary promise. Time expansion. Hours feel longer. Work sessions produce disproportionate results. The day feels less rushed, even as output increases. This is not perception, it is math. Over time, your nervous system adapts to this efficiency. Baseline stress decreases. Mental clutter reduces. You are less reactive because fewer stimuli are bidding for attention. Calm emerges as a side effect of good economics. This is why hyperfocus often feels peaceful rather than intense. The system is no longer overdrawn. The final insight of this chapter is leverage. You do not need more attention, you need less waste. Removing waste produces immediate gains. Unlike skill acquisition, this does not take years. It takes redesign. When attention stops leaking, focus stops being scarce. In the next chapter, we will apply this economic model to objectives themselves. You will see why vague goals destroy attention value, how precise objectives collapse cost, and how defining the right target makes hyperfocus not just possible, but automatic. Chapter 7. Precision of objective creates. Precision of mind focus collapses the moment an objective becomes vague. This is not a psychological weakness. It is a structural inevitability. The brain cannot commit resources to something it cannot define, and it will not sustain attention toward an outcome it cannot measure. Most people believe they lack focus when, in reality, they lack a precise target. An objective is not a desire. It is not an intention. It is not a direction like work on this, make progress, or be productive. Those are placeholders, not commands. When you sit down with a placeholder, the brain is forced to resolve ambiguity in real time. That resolution consumes attention before execution even begins. This is why starting feels heavy. When an objective is imprecise, the brain must continuously ask questions while working. Is this the right thing? Is this enough? Am I done? Should I adjust? Each question fragments attention. Each fragment weakens focus. Eventually, attention disengages entirely. Hyperfocus requires the opposite condition. It requires an objective so clear that no questions are needed once execution begins. Precision is not about complexity. It is about constraint. A precise objective defines three things explicitly: what success looks like, where the task ends, and what action comes next if completion occurs. When these parameters are set in advance, the brain no longer needs to evaluate. It can allocate attention fully. This is the second major promise of this chapter. Once objectives are precise, starting becomes automatic. Most productivity systems fail because they treat goals as motivational tools. They emphasize ambition, vision, and long-term outcomes. These may inspire, but they do not execute. Execution requires immediacy. It requires certainty in the present moment. The brain does not work toward futures, it works toward defined states. This is why large goals often produce paralysis. Build a business, write a book, get in shape are not objectives. They are categories. Categories demand decomposition. If decomposition is not done in advance, it will be done during execution where it is most expensive. When you feel overwhelmed by a task, what you are actually feeling is unprocessed structure. As you begin applying objective precision, you will notice a dramatic reduction in overwhelm. Tasks feel smaller not because they are smaller, but because their boundaries are visible. Visibility reduces perceived cost. Reduced cost invites attention. Another illusion this chapter dismantles is the belief that flexibility improves focus. In reality, excessive flexibility destroys it. When objectives are left open-ended to see how it goes, attention remains provisional. Provisional attention never deepens. Hyperfocus requires commitment. Commitment requires definition. This does not mean rigidity. It means deciding once instead of repeatedly. Decision-making is moved upstream. Execution becomes downstream. This separation is critical. As you apply this, a third measurable improvement appears: sustained depth. You will find yourself staying with tasks longer without noticing time. This is not because you are forcing attention to remain. It remains because there is no ambiguity pulling it away. The mind relaxes when it knows exactly what it is doing and why. Precision also changes how you experience progress. Vague objectives produce vague satisfaction. You never quite know if you are advancing. Precise objectives create visible movement. Movement reinforces behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. This creates a powerful feedback loop. You begin to trust the process because it produces consistent closure. Closure reduces cognitive load. Reduced load frees attention. Freed attention deepens focus. Over time, this compounds. Another critical effect of precision is resistance reduction. Many people interpret resistance as fear or procrastination. In reality, resistance often arises because the objective is undefined. The brain resists entering uncertainty. When uncertainty is removed, resistance dissipates. This is not motivational. It is mechanical. As objectives become more precise, you will also notice an increase in speed. Not frantic speed, but smooth speed. Fewer pauses, fewer corrections, less rework. Precision upstream prevents waste downstream. This is how output multiplies without acceleration. The long-term promise of objective precision is trust. You begin to trust your ability to start, continue, and finish. That trust stabilizes identity. A stable identity stabilizes focus. By this point in the book, a pattern should be clear. Hyperfocus is not trained directly. It emerges when friction is removed at multiple layers: perception, environment, economy, and now objective structure. Each layer reinforces the next. In the next chapter, we will apply strategic inversion to expose how most people unknowingly guarantee distraction. By mapping failure deliberately, you will learn how to subtract behaviors that silently destroy focus, and why removal often produces more gains than addition ever could. Chapter 8: Strategic Inversion. How distraction is actively manufactured. Most people believe distraction happens to them. It does not. Distraction is not an accident. It is the predictable outcome of a specific set of behaviors that, when combined, guarantee attention collapse. The problem is that these behaviors feel normal, harmless, and even productive. They are socially validated. That is why they are so effective at destroying focus. Strategic inversion means you stop asking how to succeed and instead ask a more precise question: how is failure being reliably produced right now? Once you ask that question honestly, patterns appear immediately. If someone wanted to design a life where hyperfocus was impossible, they would do the following. They would keep multiple tasks partially open at all times. They would avoid defining clear endpoints. They would allow constant interruption. They would switch contexts frequently. They would measure activity instead of completion. And they would keep their environment saturated with stimuli. Most people do all of this daily, then wonder why focus feels unreachable. The power of inversion is that it removes mystery. When you see distraction as a manufactured outcome, not a personal flaw, control returns. Manufactured systems can be dismantled. One of the most destructive mechanisms is context stacking. This happens when you begin a task while mentally carrying other tasks. Even if those tasks are not physically present, they remain cognitively active. The brain treats open loops as unresolved threats. Attention is divided before work begins. This guarantees shallow engagement. Another failure pattern is constant availability. When you allow yourself to be interruptible at any moment, your attention never fully commits. Part of it remains on standby, waiting to respond. This background vigilance prevents depth. Hyperfocus requires temporary isolation from reaction. Most people mistake availability for responsibility. In reality, it is a focus tax. There is also the illusion of preparation. Many people spend significant time organizing, researching, adjusting, and optimizing instead of executing. These actions feel productive because they reduce anxiety, but they delay commitment. Commitment is where focus begins. Preparation without transition into execution trains avoidance. Strategic inversion reveals a critical truth. Most distractions are self-inflicted upstream. They are not caused by external forces, but by design decisions that were never made consciously. The promise of this chapter is subtraction. You do not need new tools, techniques, or habits to improve focus. You need to remove the behaviors that mathematically prevent it. Removal produces immediate gains because it eliminates interference rather than adding complexity. As you begin applying inversion, the first improvement you will notice is mental quiet. Fewer competing thoughts, fewer urges to switch, less internal noise. This happens not because you are controlling your mind, but because you have stopped provoking it. Another shift follows quickly. You will feel a sense of seriousness when you begin work. Not pressure, but gravity. Tasks feel more real. Attention feels heavier, more anchored. This is a sign that the system is no longer leaking commitment. Inversion also exposes why multitasking feels efficient while producing so little. Switching creates the illusion of progress by keeping attention stimulated. But stimulation is not value. Value requires continuity. Inversion makes this obvious, which removes the temptation. When you see how easily focus is destroyed, you stop flirting with those behaviors, not out of discipline, but out of understanding. You would not intentionally sabotage your own system once you see the mechanism clearly. This produces a deeper promise: simplicity. As distractions are removed, work becomes simpler. Not easier in content, but cleaner in execution. There are fewer variables, fewer decisions, fewer surprises. Attention stabilizes because the system no longer demands constant adjustment. Over time, this simplicity compounds. You begin to operate with fewer active projects. You close loops faster. You trust completion more than motion. This shifts your entire relationship with work. Strategic inversion also changes how you evaluate advice. You stop asking whether something might help and start asking whether it introduces fragmentation. This filter alone protects hyperfocus. By now, a pattern should be emerging clearly. Hyperfocus is not built by adding intensity. It is built by removing contradiction. Every chapter strips away one source of interference. With enough interference removed, focus is no longer fragile. It is inevitable. In the next chapter, we will address one of the most persistent sources of interference: emotion. You will learn why emotion distorts execution, why waiting to feel ready guarantees delay, and how separating emotion from action unlocks consistent, repeatable focus, regardless of internal state. Chapter 9. Emotion is noise in the execution system. Most people believe emotion is the engine of action. They wait to feel motivated, confident, inspired, or ready before they begin. This belief quietly guarantees inconsistency. Emotion is not a reliable input. It fluctuates constantly, responds to irrelevant variables, and distorts perception under pressure. Emotion is not evil. It is simply misused. In execution, emotion functions as noise. It interferes with signal clarity. When emotion is allowed into the control loop, decisions slow, priorities blur, and action becomes conditional. Conditional action never produces hyperfocus. Hyperfocus requires continuity. Emotion interrupts continuity. The brain evolved emotion to guide survival decisions, not to optimize long-term output. Fear, excitement, boredom, and anxiety are rapid heuristics. They are useful for avoiding danger and seeking reward in uncertain environments. They are disastrous when allowed to govern structured work. When you wait to feel like working, you hand control to the least stable variable in the system. This is why productivity advice that emphasizes motivation fails over time. Motivation spikes briefly, then collapses. When it collapses, behavior stops. This trains a dangerous pattern. You associate action with emotional readiness. Over time, your system learns to delay by default. Delay feels justified because it feels emotional. The promise of this chapter is decoupling. When you remove emotion from the execution loop, work becomes mechanical. Mechanical does not mean lifeless. It means repeatable. Repeatable action produces stable output. Stable output produces evidence. Evidence reshapes identity. Identity stabilizes focus. This is the chain you are building. Most people misunderstand what it means to act without emotion. They imagine suppression, force, or numbness. That is not what is required. Emotion does not need to disappear. It needs to be demoted. Emotion can exist. It just cannot vote. The operator does not ask how they feel before acting. They ask whether the system is correctly set. If the inputs are correct, action proceeds. If the inputs are incorrect, the system is adjusted. Feeling is irrelevant to this process. This shift produces an immediate improvement. The gap between intention and action shrinks. You stop rehearsing internally. You stop bargaining with yourself. You stop needing a mental ramp-up. Starting becomes boring. That boredom is a signal of efficiency. Another critical effect of emotional detachment is resistance collapse. Much of what people call procrastination is emotional avoidance. Tasks are delayed not because they are difficult, but because they evoke discomfort. When emotion is allowed to veto action, discomfort becomes a stop signal. When emotion is removed from the decision loop, discomfort loses authority. It becomes background sensation instead of instruction. As you apply this principle, you will notice something counterintuitive. Difficult tasks will feel easier to start than easy ones that lack structure. Ease will stop correlating with emotion and start correlating with clarity. This is a major upgrade. Emotion also distorts evaluation. When you are emotionally attached to performance, you overestimate failure, underestimate progress, and misinterpret feedback. This leads to premature abandonment or unnecessary adjustment. Hyperfocus requires stable evaluation criteria, not emotional interpretation. By separating emotion from execution, you gain objectivity. Objectivity improves calibration. Calibration improves accuracy. Accuracy reduces rework. Reduced rework multiplies output. Another promise of emotional detachment is recovery speed. Interruptions, mistakes, and setbacks will still occur. The difference is how quickly you re-enter execution. When emotion is involved, recovery is slow. You ruminate, you judge, you hesitate. When emotion is excluded, recovery is immediate. You adjust and continue. This alone can double effective output over time. It is important to understand that emotional detachment does not eliminate satisfaction. It delays it. Instead of seeking emotional reward before action, you receive it after completion. This trains a healthier loop. Action precedes feeling. Feeling reinforces action. This is how professionals operate, not because they are cold, but because they are precise. As this chapter integrates, you will notice a deeper calm during work. Not relaxation, but steadiness. Fewer spikes, fewer crashes. Attention feels anchored because it is no longer being yanked by internal weather. Hyperfocus thrives in this neutrality. Over weeks of practice, emotion stops dictating your schedule. You work when it is time to work. You rest when it is time to rest. Boundaries sharpen. This reduces background stress, which further stabilizes focus. This is not emotional suppression, it is emotional containment. By now, the architecture should be clear. Hyperfocus emerges as interference is removed. Perceptual distortion, environmental noise, economic waste, vague objectives, failure patterns, and now emotional governance. Each removal tightens the system. In the next chapter, we move from removal to training. You will learn how attention itself can be conditioned directionally, how to increase its stability over time, and how deliberate repetition turns temporary focus into a reliable trained state rather than a rare occurrence. Chapter 10. Training Directional Attention. Attention does not get stronger by being strained. It gets more stable by being trained directionally. This distinction matters because most people attempt to increase focus the same way they attempt to increase effort, by forcing duration. They try to hold attention longer, and when it slips, they assume failure. This approach misunderstands how attention actually adapts. Attention is not a muscle that grows through tension. It is a targeting system that improves through repetition under correct conditions. What you repeat is not duration, but direction. Where attention is sent, how often it returns, and how cleanly it reattaches determine its stability over time. Hyperfocus is not the result of never drifting. It is the result of fast, precise reorientation. Every mind drifts. The difference between scattered individuals and focused operators is not the absence of drift, but the speed and cost of return. When returning to the when task is cheap, attention feels continuous. When returning is expensive, attention fragments. This is the first promise of this chapter. You will stop interpreting drift as failure and start treating it as a training signal. Most people sabotage attention training by layering judgment on top of drift. They notice their mind wander, then react emotionally. Frustration, self-criticism, and urgency spike. These reactions increase internal noise, making reorientation even harder. Attention slips further and the cycle repeats. Directional training removes this layer entirely. The only metric that matters is return. How quickly do you come back, and how little friction does that return carry? When return is smooth, attention strengthens naturally. This is why hyperfocus feels effortless once established. Attention is not being held in place. It is orbiting a clear target with minimal drag. To train this, attention must be given a stable anchor, not a vague intention, but a specific object of engagement. A defined task, a precise action, a narrow scope. When the anchor is clear, attention knows where to return. When the anchor is vague, drift becomes disorientation. As you apply this principle, you will notice an immediate improvement in endurance, not because attention never leaves, but because leaving no longer breaks the session. Focus resumes without restarting. Momentum survives interruption. This is a critical upgrade. Another misunderstanding is the belief that longer sessions train attention better. In reality, poorly structured long sessions train avoidance. When attention is forced to remain on ambiguous tasks, the brain learns that focus is costly. It responds by resisting sooner next time. Shorter, cleaner engagements train confidence. Each successful return reinforces the belief that focus is manageable. That belief reduces internal resistance, which stabilizes attention further. This creates a compounding loop. Directional attention training also explains why novelty hijacks focus so easily. Novel stimuli offer instant anchors. They are clear, bounded, and immediately rewarding. Work tasks often fail to compete because they lack these properties, not because they are inherently boring. When you design work to include clear anchors and visible movement, attention treats it differently. It commits. As this chapter integrates, you will notice a shift in how time feels during work. Instead of feeling like you are enduring a session, time begins to compress again. This is not because attention is stronger, but because reorientation is faster and less noticeable. Another promise here is resilience. External interruptions will still occur. The difference is that they will no longer destroy the session. You will return to depth faster because attention has been trained to snap back to a known target. This is one of the most valuable properties of hyperfocus in real environments. Not perfect isolation, but rapid recovery. Directional training also reduces fear of starting. When you trust that attention can be redirected reliably, the cost of beginning drops. You are no longer afraid of losing focus because you know how to regain it. This alone removes a major source of procrastination. Over time, attention becomes less reactive. Stimuli still appear, but they no longer automatically capture focus. The brain learns that not every signal requires engagement. This is not suppression. It is prioritization encoded through repetition. As with every chapter, identity shifts follow behavior. As attention stabilizes, you begin to see yourself as someone who can stay with work. That perception reduces anxiety around difficult tasks. Reduced anxiety lowers internal noise. Lower noise deepens focus. The system tightens again. Directional attention training does not aim for perfection. It aims for reliability. Reliable return beats heroic endurance. Consistency beats intensity. When attention is trained this way, hyperfocus stops being rare. It becomes accessible on demand, not because you summon it, but because the conditions for it have been rehearsed. In the next chapter, we will examine time itself. You will see why fragmented time destroys focus regardless of attention strength, why continuous blocks matter more than total hours, and how designing deep time windows turns trained attention into sustained high-output execution. Chapter 11. Deep time versus fragmented time. Most people believe productivity is a function of hours. They measure effort by duration and assume that more time automatically produces more output. This assumption is one of the most expensive errors in modern work. Time does not create value. Structure does. What actually produces results is not how much time you have, but how that time is shaped. There are only two types of time that matter in execution: fragmented time and deep time. Fragmented time is divided by interruption, context switching, and partial attention. Deep time is continuous, uninterrupted, and singular in direction. These two forms of time are not equivalent. They do not add up the same way. One multiplies output, the other dilutes it. 8 hours of fragmented time can produce less value than 90 minutes of deep time. This is not opinion. It is a mechanical consequence of how cognition works. Every time you switch context, the brain pays a reorientation cost. Information must be unloaded, then reloaded. Prior decisions must be reconstructed. Attention must be redirected. This cost is paid even when the switch is brief. Over a day, these costs compound until most of your cognitive energy is spent restarting rather than progressing. This is why people feel busy but unproductive. Fragmented time keeps the brain in perpetual warm-up mode. You are constantly preparing to work, rarely working. The system never stabilizes long enough for hyperfocus to emerge. Attention remains shallow because it does not trust continuity. Deep time creates the opposite condition. When the brain detects uninterrupted continuity, it commits more fully. Attention deepens because the cost of staying is lower than the cost of leaving. This is when hyperfocus becomes possible. The promise of this chapter is leverage. You do not need more time. You need fewer breaks in time. Most people attempt to manage time by optimizing schedules, calendars, and task lists. These tools are useful, but they miss the core variable. Focus is not destroyed by lack of planning. It is destroyed by context volatility. If the context keeps changing, attention never settles. Deep time is not created by finding free hours. It is created by protecting continuity. This means fewer sessions, not more. Longer blocks, not shorter ones. Clear entry and exit points, not constant availability. This often feels counterintuitive at first. People worry that longer blocks will reduce flexibility or responsiveness. In reality, the opposite happens. When deep time is protected, shallow obligations are completed faster, with less mental residue. Residue is critical here. Fragmented work leaves traces, unfinished thoughts, half decisions, unresolved questions. These traces follow you into the next task, increasing internal noise. Deep work produces closure. Closure clears the system. As you begin applying deep time principles, the first improvement you will notice is faster ramp-up. You will enter productive states more quickly because the brain expects continuity. The anxiety that often accompanies starting will diminish because the system knows it has time to settle. Another improvement follows. Depth of thinking. Ideas connect, problems unfold, solutions emerge that are invisible in fragmented states. This is not intelligence increasing, it is bandwidth being restored. Deep time also changes how mistakes are handled. In fragmented time, errors trigger disruption. You stop, reassess, and often abandon the task. In deep time, errors are absorbed into the process. You correct and continue. Momentum survives. This resilience alone dramatically increases output. Most people unknowingly sabotage deep time by scattering attention across too many open commitments. Even if interruptions are minimized externally, internal fragmentation persists. The brain knows that other contexts are waiting. This prevents full commitment. Deep time requires temporary exclusivity. This does not mean ignoring responsibilities. It means sequencing them, one context at a time, one dominant objective per block. Everything else is deferred deliberately, not forgotten. As this practice stabilizes, you will notice a shift in how days feel. Time slows down. There is less rushing, less urgency, less pressure to multitask. This is not because you are doing less. It is because you are wasting less. This leads to one of the most powerful outcomes of hyperfocus, perceived time expansion. You experience more usable time without extending the day. This is one of the clearest indicators that the system is functioning correctly. Deep time also reinforces identity. When you consistently produce meaningful output in contained blocks, you begin to trust your capacity to execute. That trust reduces pre-task anxiety. Reduced anxiety lowers internal noise. Lower noise deepens focus further. Again, the loop tightens. It is important to understand that deep time is not about isolation or austerity. It is about rhythm, periods of deep engagement followed by genuine disengagement. Fragmented time provides neither depth nor rest. Deep time provides both. When work has a clear beginning and end, rest becomes cleaner. You stop half working during rest and half resting during work. This separation reduces overall fatigue and increases sustainability. The long-term promise of deep time is not just better work. It is a calmer nervous system, fewer open loops, less background stress, more presence in both work and rest. This is why hyperfocus often feels restorative rather than draining. When attention is unified, energy is conserved. By now, it should be clear that hyperfocus is not created by intensity or endurance. It is created by continuity, clarity, and constraint. Deep time is where all three converge. In the next chapter, we will confront one of the final internal barriers to deep time, resistance. You will learn why resistance is not an obstacle to avoid, but a signal to interpret, and how correctly reading resistance transforms it from a stopping force into a directional guide for growth and focus. Chapter 12. Resistance is identity preservation. Resistance is not a problem to be eliminated. It is a signal to be decoded. Most people misinterpret resistance as weakness, fear, or lack of discipline. This misinterpretation causes them to either force action blindly or retreat entirely. Both responses waste leverage. Resistance exists for a reason. Whenever you approach work that would meaningfully change your identity, resistance appears, not because the work is harmful, but because identity is conservative by nature. The mind's primary function is not progress, it is stability. Anything that threatens an existing self-concept is treated as risk. This is why resistance shows up most reliably before the work that matters most. Trivial tasks rarely generate resistance. Important tasks almost always do. The difference is not difficulty, it is consequence. High-impact work has the potential to update how you see yourself. That update is expensive. The system hesitates. Most people respond to resistance emotionally. They label it as procrastination, self-sabotage, or fear of failure. They attempt to motivate themselves out of it or punish themselves through pressure. This turns resistance into an enemy. When resistance becomes an enemy, it gains power. The promise of this chapter is inversion of interpretation. Resistance is not a stop sign. It is a boundary marker. It shows you where your current identity ends and where a more capable identity begins. If there is no resistance, there is no identity growth occurring. Hyperfocus is often blocked not because attention is weak, but because identity is defending itself. When you sit down to do work that contradicts how you currently see yourself, the system produces friction. Thoughts appear, doubts surface, urges to delay intensify. These are not random, they are protective mechanisms. Understanding this changes everything. Once resistance is recognized as identity preservation, it loses its emotional charge. You stop asking how to eliminate it and start asking what it is protecting. That question reveals leverage. Resistance usually protects one of three things: comfort, competence, or self-image. Comfort resistance avoids effort and uncertainty. Competence resistance avoids situations where skill is unproven. Self-image resistance avoids outcomes that could disconfirm a narrative about who you are. Each type of resistance requires a different response, but none require avoidance. As you begin applying this lens, you will notice a critical improvement. Resistance stops feeling personal. It becomes informational. This alone reduces its intensity. When emotion is removed from resistance, it becomes manageable. Another shift follows quickly. You will begin to predict resistance. Instead of being surprised by it, you expect it. Expected resistance loses power. It becomes part of the process rather than an interruption to it. This expectation is one of the strongest stabilizers of hyperfocus. Most people wait to feel ready before starting important work. This guarantees delay because readiness is defined as the absence of resistance. That condition never arrives for meaningful tasks. Operators do the opposite. They treat resistance as confirmation that the task is correctly chosen. This reframe changes starting behavior. When resistance appears, instead of negotiating, you narrow the scope. You reduce the task to the smallest executable unit that still moves in the correct direction. Action breaks resistance faster than thought ever could. This is not forcing, it is bypassing identity defense through scale. As you practice this, you will notice something counterintuitive. The tasks you once avoided become easier to start than the tasks you once did reflexively. This happens because avoidance trained resistance to grow. Engagement trains resistance to shrink. Resistance adapts to behavior, not intention. Another important effect of correctly interpreting resistance is precision in work selection. You stop confusing busy work with progress. Busy work produces little resistance because it threatens nothing. High leverage work produces resistance because it matters. Once you see this clearly, resistance becomes a compass. It points toward the work that creates disproportionate returns. This is a major promise of this chapter. Directional clarity. Over time, as you repeatedly act in the presence of resistance, identity updates. What once felt threatening becomes normal. The boundary moves. Resistance shifts to a higher level of challenge. This is growth made mechanical. Hyperfocus deepens as this happens because identity and action are no longer in conflict. The work no longer contradicts who you are. It expresses who you are becoming. This is why focus feels easier at higher levels of competence, not because the work is easier, but because identity has expanded to include it. Another benefit of working with resistance instead of against it is reduced burnout. Burnout often comes from prolonged effort on low-meaning tasks combined with avoidance of high-meaning tasks. Energy is spent without identity reinforcement. This drains motivation at a deep level. When resistance-guided work becomes standard, effort produces identity reinforcement. This is energizing rather than depleting. As resistance loses its threat, hyperfocus stabilizes further. Attention no longer fractures at the edge of discomfort. It stays engaged because the system no longer interprets discomfort as danger. This is a subtle but profound shift. By now, the architecture should be nearly complete. You have removed perceptual distortions, engineered environment, stabilized attention economics, defined precise objectives, eliminated failure patterns, detached emotion, trained directional attention, structured deep time, and reinterpreted resistance. What remains is consolidation. In the next chapter, we will examine how evidence locks this entire system in place. You will learn why belief never creates identity, why evidence does, and how deliberately generating proof of focus transforms hyperfocus from a practiced state into a permanent trait. Chapter 13. Evidence is what locks hyperfocus in place. Belief does not change behavior. Insight does not change identity. Language does not reprogram the system. Only evidence does. The human brain updates its self-model based on observed results, not internal declarations. You can understand focus perfectly and still fail to embody it if your actions do not consistently produce proof. This is why so many people feel inspired after learning something new and unchanged a week later. Inspiration does not register as evidence. Hyperfocus becomes permanent only when the system accumulates undeniable proof that focus works, that it produces results, and that you are capable of sustaining it. This chapter is about locking the system. Up to this point, you have been removing interference. You have redesigned perception, environment, objectives, time, emotion, and resistance. These changes allow hyperfocus to emerge. But emergence alone is not enough. Temporary states collapse unless they are reinforced. Reinforcement requires evidence. Evidence is not abstract success. It is observable output, completed tasks, finished work, closed loops, tangible results that can be pointed to without interpretation. The brain trusts what it can see. Most people attempt to change identity directly. They tell themselves they are focused, disciplined, or productive. This creates tension because the system immediately checks for proof. When proof is missing, the claim is rejected. Identity remains unchanged. This is why affirmations fail. They ask the brain to accept a conclusion without data. The promise of this chapter is solidity. When evidence accumulates, identity updates automatically. There is no negotiation. There is no self-talk required. The system simply recalibrates to match reality. Once this happens, focus stops requiring effort because it is no longer exceptional behavior. It is expected behavior. Evidence works because it collapses doubt. Doubt consumes attention. When the brain is uncertain about your capacity to follow through, it hedges. It keeps options open. It scans for alternatives. This scanning fragments attention. Hyperfocus cannot exist in a system that does not trust itself. Each completed output reduces doubt. As you begin deliberately generating evidence, you will notice a subtle but powerful shift. The internal voice that questions whether you will finish starts to quiet, not because you silence it, but because it no longer has data to support its concern. This reduces internal noise dramatically. Evidence must be structured correctly to have this effect. Large, infrequent wins are less effective than small, repeatable completions. The brain responds more strongly to consistency than magnitude. One massive effort followed by collapse does not build trust. 10 small, finished actions do. This is why this book emphasizes closure over ambition. When you finish something, even something small, the system records a data point. Action led to completion. Completion reinforces reliability. Reliability stabilizes focus. Over time, these data points compound into a new baseline. You no longer wonder whether you can focus. You assume you can. That assumption changes behavior before action even begins. Another critical function of evidence is time compression. When the brain trusts that effort leads to completion, it commits attention faster. Starting becomes easier because the expected return is higher. This increases effective output without increasing effort. This is a key leverage point. Many people attempt to build confidence before acting. This is backward. Confidence is a byproduct of evidence, not a prerequisite. When you wait to feel confident, you delay the very actions that would generate proof. The operator acts first, records evidence second, and lets confidence emerge as a side effect. Evidence also recalibrates your perception of difficulty. Tasks that once felt heavy begin to feel manageable. This is not because they became easier, but because your system has proof that engagement does not lead to failure. Fear loses leverage when it lacks evidence. This further stabilizes hyperfocus. Another important distinction is between private evidence and public validation. Public validation is inconsistent and uncontrollable. Private evidence is stable and cumulative. The system trusts what it observes directly, not what others say. This is why tracking completion privately is more powerful than external praise. As you apply this, you will notice a strong improvement in persistence. When work becomes challenging, you are less likely to abandon it because your system expects completion. Expectation shapes behavior. This expectation is not optimism, it is memory. Memory of success reduces hesitation. Over weeks of consistent evidence generation, hyperfocus transitions from a state you enter to a trait you express. You no longer prepare yourself to focus. You simply begin. The system expects depth and produces it. This is the moment where inevitability begins to appear. It is important to understand that evidence does not need to be impressive. It needs to be consistent. Small completions done repeatedly rewire identity more effectively than occasional heroic efforts. This also protects against burnout. When identity is reinforced through manageable outputs, effort remains proportional. You do not overextend to prove yourself. You let proof accumulate naturally. Another benefit of evidence-based identity is emotional stability. When you trust your capacity to execute, anxiety drops. Anxiety is often uncertainty about future behavior. Evidence removes that uncertainty. Lower anxiety reduces internal noise. Reduced noise deepens focus. Again, the loop tightens. By this point in the book, hyperfocus should feel less mysterious. It emerges because the system now trusts itself. Trust collapses scanning. Scanning collapses distraction. Focus remains because nothing inside the system argues against it. In the next chapter, we will examine what happens when this evidence-driven system is scaled. You will learn how output multiplies without acceleration, why speed is a side effect rather than a goal, and how removing friction allows you to produce more while doing less without sacrificing quality or depth. Chapter 14. Multiplying output. Without acceleration, most people believe that producing more requires moving faster. They equate output with speed and assume that higher performance demands higher intensity. This belief quietly traps them in a cycle of urgency, fatigue, and diminishing returns. Speed pursued directly rarely produces leverage. It produces errors. Output does not multiply through acceleration. It multiplies through friction removal. Acceleration increases force. Friction determines whether that force converts into motion. When friction is high, more force produces little movement. When friction is low, even moderate force produces disproportionate results. Hyperfocus operates on this principle. At this stage in the system, you are no longer trying to work harder or longer. You are no longer trying to push attention to stay. Instead, you are observing where energy is being lost before it ever reaches execution. Most lost output does not disappear during work. It disappears before work begins or after work should have ended. It disappears in hesitation, reevaluation, correction, and rework. Hesitation is friction caused by unresolved decisions. Reevaluation is friction caused by unclear standards. Correction is friction caused by premature execution. Rework is friction caused by ambiguity upstream. None of these are solved by speed. They are solved by precision. When precision increases, work becomes smoother. Smoother work feels faster, even when pace remains unchanged. This is the first promise of this chapter: increased output without increased strain. As friction is removed, transitions shorten. Starting takes less time. Returning after interruption takes less time. Finishing takes less time. These savings compound invisibly. At the end of the day, you have produced more not because you rushed, but because you stopped paying unnecessary costs. This is why hyperfocus often feels slow from the inside and impressive from the outside. Another source of output loss is overprocessing. Many people think more thinking produces better results. In reality, thinking beyond the point of clarity produces delay. Once the next correct action is known, further analysis becomes friction. Hyperfocus respects this boundary. It does not rush thinking, but it also does not extend it unnecessarily. Decision-making happens once, upstream. Execution proceeds without interruption. This separation is critical. When decisions are revisited during execution, attention fractures, output slows, momentum breaks. When decisions are trusted, action flows. Trust is not blind. It is earned through evidence which you have been accumulating. As you apply this principle, you will notice another improvement: reduced rework. You will spend less time fixing mistakes because fewer mistakes are made. This is not because you are more careful. It is because conditions are clearer before action begins. Clarity upstream prevents waste downstream. Multiplying output also requires understanding where speed actually matters. Speed matters in transitions, not in depth. Rushing depth degrades quality. Accelerating transitions increases volume without sacrifice. Most people invert this. They rush the work and waste time between work. Hyperfocus corrects this inversion. Another misconception is that high output requires constant engagement. In reality, high output requires clean disengagement. When work sessions end cleanly, without mental residue, recovery improves. Improved recovery restores attention faster in the next session. Fragmented disengagement keeps attention partially occupied even during rest. This reduces total usable energy. Clean closure restores it. As this system stabilizes, you will notice a shift in pacing. Work sessions become intense but contained. Rest becomes deeper. There is less bleed between modes. This separation increases sustainability while maintaining high output. This is not hustle. It is efficiency. Multiplying output also depends on eliminating false urgency. Many tasks feel urgent but are not important. Urgency pulls attention toward shallow actions that provide immediate relief but little value. Hyperfocus deprioritizes urgency in favor of leverage. When leverage becomes the filter, output quality increases automatically. You will also notice that you begin finishing fewer things at once, but finishing them more completely. This reduces cognitive load. Fewer open loops mean fewer background drains. Background drains are friction. Removing them increases available attention for the next task. Again, multiplication occurs without acceleration. Another powerful effect of friction removal is consistency. Output becomes more predictable. Predictable output compounds. Compounding output creates disproportionate results over time. This is how long-term productivity is built without burnout. Burnout is usually not caused by too much work. It is caused by too much wasted work. When effort produces visible results consistently, energy replenishes itself. When effort produces ambiguity, energy drains. Hyperfocus ensures that effort converts into outcome. At this stage, work begins to feel different. There is less drama, less urgency, less emotional fluctuation. Progress feels steady, almost boring. This boredom is a sign that the system is functioning correctly. Dramatic effort is inefficient effort. The long-term promise of multiplying output without acceleration is freedom. You gain margin. Margin allows choice. Choice reduces pressure. Reduced pressure stabilizes focus further. You are no longer racing the clock. You are shaping it. As friction continues to be removed, you will find that you can take on more complex work without increasing stress. Complexity becomes manageable because execution is clean. This expands the range of what you can focus on deeply. Hyperfocus is no longer a fragile state that collapses under load. It becomes robust. In the next chapter, we will formalize this entire architecture into a closed protocol. You will see how to combine identity, environment, objectives, time, attention, resistance, and evidence into a single daily system that does not rely on motivation and does not degrade over time. This is where hyperfocus stops being practiced and starts being automated. Proximo Chapter 15, the Hyperfocus Protocol as a Closed System. Up to this point, you have been dismantling interference and installing alignment. Each chapter removed a variable that made focus fragile. Now those variables converge into a single structure. This structure is not a mindset. It is not a routine. It is a closed system. A closed system does not depend on willpower. It does not depend on mood. It does not decay when conditions are imperfect. It functions because each component reinforces the others. When one part activates, the rest follow automatically. This is the point where hyperfocus stops being something you try to enter and becomes something that initiates itself. Most people fail at consistency because their systems are open. They rely on motivation to start, discipline to continue, and restraint to avoid distraction. Each of these variables is unstable. When one fails, the entire structure collapses. The Hyperfocus protocol is designed to remove these dependencies entirely. A closed system begins with pre-decision. Decisions are made once, upstream, when attention is available, not repeatedly during execution. When you decide in advance what matters, when it starts and when it ends, you eliminate negotiation. Negotiation is where focus dies. This is the first promise of the protocol. No more internal bargaining. When execution begins, there are no questions to answer, no priorities to evaluate, no alternatives to consider. The system is already decided. Action proceeds not because you feel aligned, but because there is nothing else to do. This creates immediate stability. The protocol also integrates environment as an active component. The space you enter carries intention for you. It signals what behavior is expected. There are fewer objects, fewer stimuli, fewer options. Each reduction removes cognitive load. The environment does not inspire focus, it enforces it. This is not aesthetic minimalism, it is behavioral engineering. Time is also treated structurally. Work happens inside defined blocks, with clear entry and exit. There is a beginning ritual that signals commitment and an ending ritual that signals closure. These signals train the nervous system to switch modes cleanly. Over time, transition becomes automatic. Automatic transition is one of the most underestimated advantages of high performers. Within the block, attention is given a single anchor. Not a vague intention, but a concrete action. When attention drifts, it is returned without judgment. Judgment would add noise. Return is the only operation required. This is how attention is conserved rather than spent. Resistance is expected, not avoided. Its appearance is treated as confirmation that the work is correctly chosen. Instead of escalating effort, scope is reduced until movement resumes. Movement dissolves resistance faster than force ever could. Emotion is present but irrelevant. The protocol does not ask how you feel. It asks whether the system is ready. If the inputs are correct, action occurs. This is not coldness, it is clarity. Evidence is recorded deliberately. Completion is marked. Closure is visible. The brain registers proof that focus led to outcome. This proof feeds identity. Identity feeds future focus. The loop closes. Once this loop is established, motivation becomes unnecessary. The system self-propels. The critical feature of a closed system is that failure becomes difficult. Missing a session feels strange. Fragmentation feels uncomfortable. Distraction feels expensive. These sensations are not imposed through discipline. They emerge because the system has adapted to a new baseline. This is when hyperfocus becomes robust. Another promise of the protocol is resilience. When something breaks, you do not collapse. You adjust one component and continue. There is no need to restart the entire system. Closed systems degrade gracefully. This is essential for real life. Most people abandon systems the moment they are interrupted. The Hyperfocus protocol expects interruption. It is designed to absorb it. Recovery is built in. Return is trained. Continuity survives. As this protocol stabilizes, work stops feeling heroic. There are no peaks and crashes, no dramatic surges of effort followed by exhaustion. Output becomes even, predictable, sustainable. This is what inevitability feels like. Another important effect is identity compression. You stop seeing focus as a special trait and start seeing it as standard behavior. You no longer describe yourself as someone trying to be productive. You simply execute. Language simplifies. Self-concept stabilizes. When identity stabilizes, future planning changes. You plan more realistically because you trust execution. You take on projects with higher leverage because you know you can sustain depth. This expands your range without increasing stress. At this stage, hyperfocus no longer depends on protection. You do, not need perfect silence or isolation. The system carries focus with it. Environment helps, but identity now does most of the work. This is the transition from training to automation. The final promise of the closed system is freedom. When focus is reliable, mental bandwidth is freed. You stop worrying about whether you will do the work. You simply do it. This reduces background anxiety dramatically. Calm becomes the default. By now, hyperfocus should no longer feel mysterious. It is the mechanical outcome of correct design. Nothing here relies on belief. Everything relies on alignment. In the final chapter, we will complete the transformation by making hyperfocus irreversible. You will see how identity fully absorbs the system, how focus becomes non-negotiable, and how the operator you have been training becomes the only version of you that remains active under pressure. Chapter 16. Making hyperfocus inevitable. At this stage, hyperfocus is no longer something you access. It is something you default to. The difference is subtle but absolute. States can be lost. Defaults persist. The final transition is not behavioral. It is identity-level compression. Identity is not who you think you are. It is what remains consistent under pressure. When conditions degrade, when energy drops, when emotion spikes, identity decides what happens next. This is why most people lose focus precisely when it matters most. Their identity cannot support it. To make hyperfocus inevitable, the system must survive stress. Up to now, you have trained focus in controlled conditions. You have reduced noise, engineered environment, clarified objectives, structured time, removed emotional interference, and built evidence. These changes create reliability, but inevitability requires something more: non-negotiability. Non-negotiability does not mean rigidity. It means there is no internal debate. The moment focus becomes part of identity, the question, "Will I work?" disappears. The only remaining question is, what is the next correct action? When this happens, distraction no longer feels tempting. It feels incorrect. This is the final promise of the book: focus that does not require protection. Most people assume inevitability comes from intensity. They imagine relentless discipline or extreme self-control. This is another illusion. Intensity is brittle. It breaks under fatigue. Inevitability is quiet. It persists. Inevitability is built through repetition under imperfect conditions. When you execute even when tired, even when bored, even when uncertain, and still produce closure, identity updates. The system learns that focus is not conditional. It is expected. This expectation becomes self-enforcing. At this point, failure to focus feels stranger than focus itself. This does not happen through one breakthrough. It happens through accumulation. Each time you follow the protocol without negotiating, you reinforce inevitability. Each time you remove choice from execution, you strengthen the identity. Choice is the enemy of inevitability. Once identity absorbs the system, effort drops further, not because work disappears, but because resistance no longer appears at the identity level. You are no longer acting against yourself. Action expresses who you are. This is why high performers often describe their work as simple. Not easy, but simple. There is no drama, no internal conflict, no oscillation between desire and avoidance. The system runs. Another sign that inevitability has formed is emotional neutrality. You no longer need to feel good to work, and work no longer determines how you feel. Emotion becomes background data, not instruction. This stabilizes attention under pressure. Pressure is the true test. When deadlines compress, when stakes rise, when uncertainty increases, most systems collapse. The hyperfocus system tightens. Constraints sharpen clarity. Resistance signals direction. Focus deepens because the system has been trained for exactly these conditions. This is when hyperfocus becomes an advantage rather than a coping mechanism. At this stage, productivity stops being a goal. It becomes a side effect. Output increases because nothing blocks it. Time expands because waste has been removed. Energy stabilizes because effort converts cleanly into result. You are no longer managing attention. You are deploying it. The final identity shift is subtle but permanent. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs tools, tricks, or motivation to function. You see yourself as an operator of systems. When something breaks, you do not blame yourself. You adjust the structure. This creates calm. Calm is not the absence of pressure. It is the absence of internal chaos. Hyperfocus thrives in calm because calm preserves signal integrity. Signal integrity preserves precision. Precision produces inevitability. At this point, the loop is closed. Perception is accurate. Decisions are obvious. Action is frictionless. Results are consistent. Identity is reinforced. The system feeds itself. There is nothing left to add. The work now is maintenance, not struggle. You return to the protocol when drift appears. You adjust inputs when output degrades. You treat focus as infrastructure, not as a mood. This is how hyperfocus survives long term. The final truth of this audiobook is simple and unforgiving. Reality rewards precision, not effort. Focus is not a gift. It is not a trait. It is the natural consequence of alignment. When alignment is correct, hyperfocus is inevitable. Action is the only interface with reality. Accuracy collapses probability into inevitability. The system is now yours to run. If you listen to this audiobook all the way to the end, you already did something most people never do. You stayed. Staying is not passive, it is evidence. It means your attention was not stolen. It means you followed a complete causal chain instead of consuming fragments. That alone signals an identity shift already in motion. Now anchor it. If this system resonated, if you recognized yourself in the failures it dismantled and the structure it built, mark the transition deliberately. Identity changes through evidence, and evidence is strengthened through declaration, followed by action. Write this phrase exactly as it is. I am changing my identity through precision and execution. Do not treat it as motivation. Treat it as a checkpoint, a signal that the old operating system has been observed, understood, and replaced. From this point forward, you do not ask whether you will focus. You ask what the system requires. You do not negotiate with distraction. You remove it. You do not wait to feel ready. You act, then let evidence speak. Hyperfocus is no longer something you seek. It is what happens when you operate correctly. You now know the architecture, run it.